Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. Imagine the night air of the South Pacific, thick, wet, and heavy with the scent of rotting palm fronds. It is August 19, 1942, and deep within the tangled green labyrinth near Taivu Point, Guadalcanal, the jungle itself seems to hold its breath. Beneath the suffocating canopy, Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imai of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company pauses to scribble into his diary. His words, fragments of awe, disbelief, and grim anticipation, capture the collective shock of men who have stepped into a world they do not yet understand. Picture it, Namana 16 soldiers, veterans hardened by years of victories in China and Southeast Asia, now crouched among the roots and vines after landing from destroyers under cover of darkness. Their commander, Colonel Ichiki, stands firm in his conviction. His orders are clear. This is the first strike to reclaim Henderson Field, the airstrip stolen by the Americans. They have been told the enemy is weak, no more than 2,000 men pampered by luxury, untested in the crucible of war. Ichiki, with the cold confidence of a man who has never lost, waves aside all caution. "They are Americans," he tells his officers. "We will drive them into the sea before dawn." But how could he know? How could any of them imagine that this very jungle, this familiar ally of stealth and night, would turn traitor? That the darkness they once ruled would betray them? Within hours, these soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, men who had known only triumph since 1937, would confront a force that would not simply defeat them, it would dismantle the very foundation of their military doctrine. Every tactic, every certainty, every myth of invincibility would shatter against the unyielding machinery of American firepower and coordination. The storm had been gathering since August 7th, when 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division, led by General Alexander Vandegrift, surged ashore at Lunga Point. The mission bore the deceptively modest name Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive of the Pacific War. On paper, their objective seemed simple: seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield, fortify it, and hold until relief arrived. In reality, they were stepping into a nightmare, a campaign that would push the limits of human endurance further than any in Marine Corps history. Now, imagine standing where they did. Before you lies Guadalcanal, 90 miles of raw, hostile earth, 25 miles across, its spine a jagged wall of mountains clawing 8,000 feet into eternal clouds. The coastal plain around Henderson Field is a suffocating tangle of kunai grass, swamp, and jungle so dense that visibility shrinks to mere feet. The heat is not just oppressive, it is alive, pressing in from all sides. The humidity never dips below 90%. Mosquitoes swarm so thickly that men choke on them as they breathe. The rivers, glistening like silver veins from the air, are death traps filled with parasites. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, unseen enemies that would claim more Marines than Japanese bullets ever could. And yet, on that first morning, the Americans find almost no resistance. The 2,200 Japanese laborers and 600 naval troops scatter into the jungle, leaving behind food, weapons, and, most importantly, the unfinished airfield. As the tropical sun dips below the horizon on August 8th, American engineers are already laying the final strips of runway. Soon, it will bear the name Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, the Marine aviator who fell at Midway. The stage is set. The island breathes, waiting, a green inferno ready to consume the ambitions of both empires. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound, the deep, rising growl of engines echoing through the jungle canopy. Within days of that first landing, the air above Guadalcanal would thunder with the arrival of American aircraft. They came one by one, then in squadrons, until the island itself seemed to breathe fire. History would remember them as the Cactus Air Force, a ragged, improvised band of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots who would turn a rough jungle strip into the most important airfield in the Pacific. But the Japanese were not idle. Their counterstrike came swiftly and with devastating precision. On the night of August 9th, under a moon veiled by clouds, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and a lone destroyer through the darkness like steel sharks gliding toward their prey. What followed, the Battle of Savo Island, would enter the annals of naval history as the worst defeat ever suffered by the United States Navy. In less than an hour, the sea became an inferno. The USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra were torn apart by shell fire and torpedoes, their burning hulls lighting the black waters like floating funeral pyres. Over 1,000 sailors perished, men who had no time even to reach their lifeboats. When dawn rose over that blood-streaked sea, the surviving Allied ships limped away, taking with them what remained of the supplies meant for the Marines ashore. The men of the 1st Marine Division were now alone, stranded, undersupplied, and facing a determined enemy eager for revenge. Yet, amid this chaos, the Japanese command overlooked a single, fatal truth. Henderson Field had become the beating heart of the Pacific War. Whoever held that airstrip controlled the surrounding seas by day. From there, American aircraft could strike any Japanese vessel within a 200-mile radius. This simple fact, invisible on maps but decisive in reality, would shape every battle that followed. The Japanese could own the night. Under the cover of darkness, destroyers raced down the Tokyo Express, carrying troops and supplies through waters they dominated after sunset. But when the sun rose, the balance shifted. American aircraft roared into the sky, and the hunters of the night became prey by day. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo understood only part of the danger. Henderson Field had to be taken back immediately. The task fell to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake and his 17th Army, based in Rabaul. His resources, however, were painfully limited. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was still in Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment remained in the Philippines. The nearest available force was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, stationed near Guam, a unit originally destined for the ill-fated Midway operation. Ichiki himself was a complex figure, a former instructor at the infantry school, known for his tactical skill but also for his impulsive nature and unshakable faith in the spiritual supremacy of Japanese warriors over material power. Before departing Truk, his orders were explicit: wait for the rest of his regiment before engaging. But Ichiki had read every report about Americans in China and the Philippines, and he dismissed them all as soft, undisciplined, and weak-willed. In his mind, the battle would be over before the enemy understood they were under attack. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers sliced through the dark waters and deposited 917 men of Ichiki's first element at Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing went perfectly. No alarms, no resistance. Ichiki, confident and eager, immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols into the jungle, a standard move in any textbook, but one that would soon seal his fate. The following morning, August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by Captain Charles Brush, was moving cautiously along the coastal track toward Coley Point. Through the shimmering heat and the rustle of palm leaves, they spotted movement. Japanese soldiers. What followed was a brief, savage clash. In minutes, the jungle erupted in gunfire. When the smoke cleared, 31 Japanese lay dead, and among their bodies, Marines found documents, maps, orders, and strength reports that revealed not only the presence of a substantial enemy force, but also that the Japanese grossly underestimated American numbers. Captain Brush hurried back to General Vandegrift with his grim prize. The general understood instantly. The attack was coming, and soon. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to reinforce the eastern defenses, particularly along the mouth of the river. The Marines called the Tenaru, though its real name was the Ilu. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, dug in along the riverbank, setting machine guns to create deadly overlapping fields of fire across the sandbar. Then came the night of August 20th, 21, a night that would be etched forever into Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki, unwilling to wait for reinforcements or even for word from his missing patrol, chose to attack. He would strike directly across the sandbar, in the tradition of the bold, spirit-driven assaults that had brought Japan victory after victory. To him, courage and the will to die gloriously could overcome even the heaviest enemy guns. Just past midnight, a half-crazed Solomon Island scout named Jacob Vuza, who had miraculously escaped Japanese captivity after brutal torture, stumbled into Marine lines. He gasped out a warning, "They're coming." Minutes later, the night exploded. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, bayonets glinting, their voices rising in wild battle cries. But the Marines were ready. The M1917 Browning machine guns, heavy, water-cooled relics from the last war, thundered to life. Each weapon spat 600 rounds a minute, a relentless metal storm that cut down the attackers in swaths. The Marines had positioned their guns so skillfully that no inch of the sandbar lay unprotected. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry surged forward, their bodies silhouetted against the muzzle flashes. Those who somehow made it across met the fury of 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shot, giant shotgun shells that tore men apart at close range. The assault dragged on for hours. Some Japanese broke through to the Marine lines, where desperate hand-to-hand combat erupted. Rifles turned to clubs, knives flashed in the darkness, fists struck flesh. But the line held. The American defense was a machine, precise, disciplined, unstoppable. By dawn, the beach was silent, except for the groans of the dying. Over 800 Japanese soldiers lay scattered across the sandbar and in the shallow water. The survivors huddled in the jungle, stunned, disbelieving. The sun rose slowly over Guadalcanal, its light glinting off spent shell casings and the rippling tide. And for the first time, the myth of Japanese invincibility lay shattered in the tropical sand. Picture the dawn of August 21st, 1942, the first light of day spreading across the blood-soaked sandbar of the Tenaru River. The air was still heavy with smoke, the jungle eerily silent except for the distant groans of the wounded. But for the Marines, the battle was not yet done. General Alexander Vandegrift, understanding the importance of momentum, ordered an immediate counterattack. From behind the American lines came the mechanical roar of engines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks, squat and nimble, their steel hulls glinting in the early sun. They rumbled across the sandbar, fanning out like predators in search of prey. Inside their turrets, The gunners scanned the coconut groves ahead, where shattered remnants of Colonel Ichiki's force had taken refuge among the trees. From his position near the front, war correspondent Richard Tregaskis watched the strange, almost surreal scene unfold. It was fascinating to see them bustling among the trees, he later wrote, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We hadn't realized there were so many Japanese in the grove. Group after group were flushed out and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday, the battle that had begun as a daring night assault was over. Of the 17 Japanese soldiers who had landed so confidently at Taivu Point, around 800 lay dead. The few survivors, roughly 128 men, mostly from support units who had remained near the beach, melted into the jungle, carrying with them the grim news of total destruction. From the dense hills, a radio signal reached 17th Army Headquarters. The Ichiki detachment has been annihilated. Among the fallen was Colonel Colonel Ichiki himself. Accounts of his final moments would differ. The official version claimed he had burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Others insisted he died in a final hopeless charge. However he met his end, his defeat marked the first great rupture in Japan's myth of invincibility. American losses were astonishingly light, about 40 killed and wounded. Yet the psychological impact on the Japanese command was catastrophic. Captured documents and later testimony revealed disbelief, the utter incomprehension of soldiers who could not fathom how an entire regiment had been erased in a single night. The Americans, they realized too late, did not behave as Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic under attack, did not flee before the fury of screaming bayonets. Instead, they had waited, calm, disciplined, allowing their enemies to walk straight into meticulously prepared killing zones. The shock deepened when Japanese officers examined captured American equipment. What they found was staggering. The Browning machine guns, those water-cooled monsters that had poured out death hour after hour, had never jammed, never overheated, never faltered. Every Marine carried more ammunition than a Japanese squad. Their artillery could be summoned with uncanny precision, their infantry, artillery, and even naval gunnery operating in seamless coordination, a system of destruction the Japanese army had never encountered. But even as Tokyo absorbed the humiliation, the next act was already taking shape. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, determined to avenge Ichiki's loss and reclaim Henderson Field, assembled a massive naval operation. On August 16th, 3 transport ships departed Truk, carrying 1,400 more soldiers from Ichiki's regiment and 500 naval Marines. Yet fate struck again. After the Battle of the Eastern Solomons damaged one of the transports, Japanese command abandoned the use of slow cargo ships altogether. From then on, they would rely on destroyers, the swift, nocturnal lifeline that Allied troops would soon know as the Tokyo Express. Between August 29th and September 4th, wave after wave of destroyers and light cruisers dashed down from the Shortland Islands, landing nearly 5,000 troops from Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade at Taivu Point. The system was ingenious. A destroyer could make the entire round trip in a single night, slipping past American aircraft that dominated the skies by day. But this brilliance hid a fatal flaw. Speed came at a terrible cost. Heavy equipment couldn't come with them, no artillery, no tanks, no trucks, and, most crippling of all, little food or ammunition. The soldiers who came ashore carried only what they could bear on their backs. They would soon discover that the greatest enemy on Guadalcanal was not always the Marine, but hunger. General Kawaguchi fixed September 12th as the date for his grand assault on Henderson Field. His plan was bold, even elegant in conception, a three-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coast. Another would drive up from the south through the choking jungle toward what Japanese intelligence believed to be the weakest point in the American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main force, advancing along a narrow inland ridge that loomed over Henderson Field like a watchtower. What he did not know, what his intelligence had fatally overlooked, was that the Americans already anticipated this very move. On September 8th, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, launched a daring raid on Tasimboko village. There, his men discovered vast Japanese supply caches, ammunition, food, medical gear, proof of a major offensive in preparation. Edson instantly grasped the plan. The Japanese would come from the south, using the ridge as their main route of attack. He requested permission to dig in there, and General Vandegrift agreed. Over September 10th and 11th, Edson's 840 Marines, raiders and parachutists alike, fortified the ridge. They laid out firing lines with the same cold precision that had doomed Ichiki's men at the Tenaru. Machine guns were placed to create interlocking fields of fire. Mortar crews calibrated their weapons on every likely approach. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted exact coordinates for defensive barrages. The ridge itself was a cruel, narrow spine of coral, about 1,000 meters long, broken into 3 knolls tufted with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines yawned on either side, thick with jungle so dense it swallowed light. For attackers, it was the perfect ground for infiltration. For defenders, if they held their nerve, it was the perfect killing ground. And so, as night fell on September 12th, the jungle once again came alive with whispers and movement. Kawaguchi's soldiers, ghosts in the dark, crept through the ravines toward the ridge. Unlike Ichiki's doomed banzai charge, this would be a calculated strike. Silent, enveloping, sophisticated. The Marines, waiting in the blackness, could hear them coming. The second great test of Guadalcanal was about to begin. The night of September 12, 1942, descended over Guadalcanal like a living thing, humid, suffocating, alive with whispers and the click of metal on coral. Through the darkness, General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's troops crept forward, small patrols probing the American line, testing, searching for weakness. When they found a gap, larger groups followed, slipping through the ravines on both flanks of the ridge, hoping to split the Marines in two. But the ridge, that narrow spine of coral and kunai grass, was ready for them. The Marines had turned it into a fortress. The battle that followed was chaos incarnate. Flares burst overhead, casting fleeting ghostly light on scenes of hand-to-hand combat as Japanese soldiers materialized out of the blackness within grenade range of the trenches. Men fought not as soldiers, but as survivors, with rifles, pistols, bayonets, shovels, even bare hands. The din of the fight was relentless. Shouted orders, the rattle of machine guns, the thunder of mortars. Whenever the Japanese massed for a breakthrough, Marine artillery tore them apart. The 11th Marines unleashed more than 2,000 shells that night, firing so close to their own lines that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews worked until their weapons glowed cherry red in the darkness. Through it all, familiar figures moved among the foxholes. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same Solomon Island scout who had warned of the Tenaru attack weeks earlier, limped through the chaos, pointing out infiltration routes, urging Marines to hold their ground. In one sector, Sergeant John Bassalone, a barrel-chested Marine from New Jersey, took command of a machine gun position that had become the linchpin of the defense. When his crews were killed or wounded, Basilone fought on alone, feeding belts of ammunition into his gun with blistered hands, firing until the barrels smoked and the enemy broke. For his valor that night, he would receive the Medal of Honor. By the time dawn broke on September 13th, the ridge was littered with bodies. Kawaguchi's first assault had failed, but he still had men left, and he was not finished. As the morning mist lifted, Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson ordered his troops to pull back slightly, consolidating around the center of the ridge to tighten their lines. General Vandergrift rushed reinforcements forward, bringing the total defending force to about 2,500 Marines. The second night was worse. At sunset, the Japanese came again, desperate, determined, their shouts echoing through the ravines. They charged in waves, throwing grenades, firing rifles, lunging with bayonets. Some reached within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being driven back. The fighting was so fierce that at one point, Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined his men on the line, firing into the dark. But the result was the same. American firepower, mortars, machine guns, artillery, ripped apart each attack. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had collapsed completely. Between 830 and 850 Japanese soldiers lay dead across what would forever be called Edson's Ridge, or more grimly, Bloody Ridge. Marine losses totaled about 104 killed and over 200 wounded. Costly, but nothing compared to the devastation inflicted on the attackers. The ridge had become more than a battlefield. It was a symbol, proof that discipline, coordination, and technology could shatter even the fiercest spirit. For the surviving Japanese, the shock was absolute. Their training, their doctrine, their faith in night attacks and warrior spirit had failed. Captured diaries revealed the same haunting realization. The Americans were not fighting as expected. They did not panic in the dark. They did not retreat before the charge. They waited, silent and precise, luring attackers into killing zones where artillery and machine guns did the work of annihilation. The battles of Tenaru and Bloody Ridge established a grim pattern, one that would define the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese would continue to rely on courage, stealth, and night tactics. The Americans would counter with overwhelming firepower, airtight coordination, and defenses engineered to maximize every advantage. The results became predictable. Japanese losses catastrophic, American casualties painful, but sustainable. Yet numbers alone cannot capture the horror of Guadalcanal. The island itself was a predator, an enemy that spared no one. Disease stalked both armies as ruthlessly as any gunfire. Malaria infected nearly every man who stayed more than a few weeks. By December 1942, over 8,000 cases were recorded in the 1st Marine Division. Tropical ulcers and fungal infections ate through skin. Dysentery spread through the camps like wildfire. Men's teeth abscessed, their gums bled, their bodies weakened until even walking became agony. And if the Americans suffered, the Japanese suffered far worse. Their supply lines, strangled by American air and naval dominance, could barely deliver food, let alone medicine. The Tokyo Express brought men, but not enough rice to feed them. Soldiers survived on coconuts, jungle roots, and whatever they could steal or scavenge. Starvation became a daily companion. Their bellies shrank, their eyes hollowed. Medical supplies vanished. Quinine, the only defense against malaria, ran out early and never returned. Wounds that might have been trivial became fatal. Infection, fever, and hunger claimed more lives than American bullets ever could. A Japanese medical report from late October told the grim truth. Over 60% of the 17th Army was incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat strength had fallen to barely 30% of authorized numbers. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, most not from battle, but from the jungle itself. Guadalcanal had become a place where even victory tasted like death, an island that devoured men, pride, and illusion alike. By October 1942, Guadalcanal had become the measure of endurance, not only of men, but of systems. On one side stood the United States Marines, supplied by sea and air, anchored by the lifeline that was Henderson Field. On the other, the Imperial Japanese Army, surviving on courage, starvation, and the fading myth of invincibility. The unequal war of logistics. Every day, American transports arrived under the watchful protection of Marine fighters roaring overhead from Henderson. Cargo nets swung through the humid air, unloading boxes of food, crates of ammunition, drums of fuel, and desperately needed medical supplies. Even after the brutal naval battles of August and September temporarily severed their supply chain, the flow was restored within weeks. By October, the Americans were reliably resupplied. Their meals came from tins, unappetizing but nourishing, and their ammunition stores were deep enough that machine gunners could fire until barrels melted, then simply requisition new ones. Behind the front, field hospitals operated with surgical precision. There were plasma transfusions, sulfa drugs to fight infection, and even the promise of evacuation for the gravely wounded. In the grim calculus of war, the Americans had built an island-wide machine that could sustain battle indefinitely. Across the jungle, the Japanese lived a different reality. Their lifeline, the Tokyo Express, brought men but almost no supplies. Destroyers could not carry heavy loads. Every sack of rice, every shell, every bandage was precious. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was rationed so severely that many units were ordered to fire only when a target was certain. Medical care, when it existed at all, was primitive. A hospital meant a canvas tarp, a single bandage reused until it fell apart, and the faint hope of survival. If you were wounded badly, you were handed a grenade. The order was clear: do not be captured. The October offensive. In late October, the Japanese made one final bid to retake Guadalcanal. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, came to the island to direct the attack himself. This time, he brought veterans, battle-hardened men of the 2nd Division, fresh from campaigns in China. Their plan was ambitious, a coordinated strike from multiple directions, with the main effort once again driving from the south toward Henderson Field. On October 23rd, the offensive began with a feint from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare and precious on Guadalcanal, rumbled across the Tenaru River, leading infantry in a frontal assault. Waiting for them were the men of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment, the first U.S. Army unit to join the Marines on the island. Anti-tank gunners opened fire, followed by artillery, and even an American M3 Stuart tank. Within minutes, all 9 Japanese tanks were burning wrecks, their crews dead or fleeing. The attack dissolved in chaos. But the main blow was yet to come. On the night of October 24, 25, Major General Yumio Nasu led 5,600 men through the jungle toward the southern perimeter of Henderson Field. Their objective was simple: annihilate the Americans guarding the airstrip. Waiting for them was Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry. Puller's name would become legend, and this night would be one reason why. The Japanese came in waves, hundreds at a time, screaming, firing, throwing grenades. Each time they broke through, the Marines counterattacked instantly, sealing the breach. The 11th Marines rained shells so close that explosions shook the trenches. Offshore, the USS Washington, a modern battleship bristling with 16-inch guns, stood ready to deliver naval fire support if the line faltered. At one critical point, a single Marine battalion was all that stood between the enemy and Henderson Field, but they did not yield. Among them, once again, was Sergeant John Basilone, the hero of Bloody Ridge. When his section ran low on ammunition, he sprinted through enemy fire to bring more. He repaired jammed guns under direct assault, and when one position was overrun, he drew his .45 pistol and led a counterattack to retake it. His courage held a line. By dawn, October 25th, the jungle fell silent. The Japanese offensive had collapsed. General Nasu lay dead, killed by machine gun fire. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers were gone, their bodies scattered in front of the Marine positions. American casualties numbered in the hundreds, severe but sustainable. The sea turns. Even as the ground battle raged, the ocean around Guadalcanal erupted into one of the fiercest naval struggles in history. From November 12 to 15, 1942, the naval battle of Guadalcanal would decide the fate of the campaign and perhaps the Pacific. In the chaotic night of November 13th, U.S. and Japanese warships clashed at point-blank range, their searchlights cutting through the darkness as shells tore ships apart. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, and both Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were killed, the only U.S. flag officers to die in surface combat during the war. But the Japanese lost far more. Their battleship Hiei, crippled in the melee, was sunk the next day by aircraft from Henderson Field. The bombardment force, meant to obliterate the airstrip, never fired a shot. 2 nights later, the battleship Kirishima attempted to finish the job. It met the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a stunning display of radar-directed fire, Washington's gun spoke first. 9 16-inch shells found their mark. When the smoke cleared, Kirishima was gone, her wreckage sinking into Iron Bottom Sound. Most decisive of all, American air and sea power destroyed a Japanese convoy carrying the 38th Division, more than 10,000 men and their heavy equipment. Of 11 transports, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and all were destroyed by bombing and shell fire before they could unload. Over 5,000 Japanese soldiers were lost in the disaster. It was the end. After November 1942, Japan would never again attempt to land a full division on Guadalcanal. Their dream of retaking Henderson Field died in those waters amid the burning hulks of transports and the black smoke rising over Iron Bottom Sound. Guadalcanal was no longer just a battle. It was a turning point. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, and the long, bloody road across the Pacific had begun. By November 1942, the war on Guadalcanal had ceased to be a campaign of maneuver. It had become a slow, merciless process of disintegration. For the Japanese soldiers still clinging to the island's jungles, November marked the beginning of the end, the long descent into starvation. They had been promised reinforcements and resupply. They had fought and waited in the fetid dark for ships that never came. Then word spread through the camps like a fever. The convoys were gone, the fleet defeated, the sea controlled by the enemy. No help was coming. Rations, already meager, were cut again. Men who had once lived on 2 rice balls a day now received 1. When that ran out, they chewed grass and bark, scraped the inner skins of palm trees, and risked death from poisonous plants. Their uniforms rotted, their bodies wasted away, medical supplies vanished. Field hospitals, if the word applied, became places of silent surrender where men lay waiting for death. Captured diaries from those final months revealed the inner collapse with haunting clarity. One officer wrote, "We burn the dead when we can. The smell hangs in the trees. I have not eaten for 2 days. We are becoming like ghosts." By December, even Japanese headquarters at Rabaul could no longer deny the truth. Guadalcanal had become a graveyard. The 17th Army, once 36,000 strong, was now reduced to perhaps 11,000 survivors, of whom barely 7,000 could still walk. The rest were skeletal shapes, too weak to lift their rifles. The Imperial Command made a decision that would have been unthinkable only months before: evacuation. Publicly, it was called Operation K, a redeployment. Privately, it was an admission of defeat. Between February 1st and 7th, 1943, in a series of brilliantly executed destroyer runs reminiscent of the Tokyo Express, the Japanese Navy extracted 10,152 men from Guadalcanal. It was a rare success, efficient, disciplined, and daring, but it could not disguise the scale of the disaster. Of the 36,000 Japanese soldiers who had fought for the island, 25,000 to 30,000 were dead. Roughly 14,800 were killed in battle. Another 10,000 to 15,000 succumbed to disease, starvation, or exhaustion. American losses, though severe, were sustainable. 600 killed, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by malaria and dysentery. Yet for every Marine or soldier who fell, another was already training. Another ship was already steaming west. Another aircraft rolling off an assembly line. The industrial power of the United States had become a weapon in itself. A broken doctrine. The psychological shock for the Japanese military was immense. For the first time in modern history, an Imperial Army force had been decisively defeated in sustained ground combat. Every assault had failed. Every night attack, once the symbol of Japanese tactical superiority, had been met with disciplined, devastating resistance. In the aftermath, surviving officers wrote with painful honesty. They identified the same truths again and again. They had underestimated American fighting spirit. They had misunderstood the scale of American logistics and industry. Their own supply systems were incapable of sustaining extended campaigns. Spiritual power and individual courage could not overcome firepower, organization, and technology. As one veteran reflected after the war, we believed that bravery could overcome machines. On Guadalcanal, we learned that machines guided by system and discipline will always win. Systems of War Guadalcanal was not merely a test of men, it was a test of systems. The Americans had them, the Japanese did not. The U.S. military possessed functioning networks of supply, medicine, communication, and fire coordination. When a Marine called for artillery, rounds fell within minutes. When a man was wounded, plasma and sulfa drugs were waiting. When a unit ran low on ammunition, trucks or mules delivered more by nightfall. The Japanese had none of this. Their logistics were heroic improvisation, brave but hopeless. Technically, the disparity was staggering. Japanese infantry carried Arisaka bolt-action rifles, accurate but slow. Many Marines began the campaign with M1IO3 Springfields, but increasingly they were armed with the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. In close combat, the Garand's speed and reliability were decisive. Machine guns widened the gulf further. The American Browning M1917 a heavy, water-cooled weapon, could fire endlessly as long as water and ammunition were available. Japanese Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns were easier to carry but overheated quickly and jammed under sustained fire. Artillery told the rest of the story. The 11th Marines employed M1A1 75 mm pack howitzers. weapons light enough to be manhandled through the jungle, yet powerful enough to shatter any infantry assault. Forward observers embedded with Marine units could summon fire missions by radio, bringing shells down within minutes. Japanese guns, few and immobile, were starved of ammunition. Even the sea spoke for the Americans. Destroyers and cruisers offshore provided immediate, accurate naval gunfire. Observers with field radios could adjust salvos in real time. Japanese troops had no such support. Their navy, once their greatest strength, had been driven back. And overhead, the sky belonged to the Cactus Air Force. Operating from the battered strip at Henderson Field, Marine and Army pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Era Cobras, and P-40 Warhawks steadily gained control of the air. Their SBD Dauntless dive bombers hunted Japanese transports and positions relentlessly. Japanese aircraft from Rabaul, forced to fly at the extreme edge of their range, arrived tired, short on fuel, and with barely 10 minutes to fight before they had to turn back. The lesson of Guadalcanal. In the end, Guadalcanal was not won simply by courage. Both sides had that in abundance. It was won by organization, logistics, and adaptation. The Americans had learned to fight in the jungle, to fuse air, land, and sea into a single lethal system. The Japanese had fought with unmatched bravery, but bravery alone could not feed starving men or supply empty guns. When the last Japanese destroyer slipped away from Guadalcanal in the darkness of February 1943, it carried not only the remnants of an army, but the death of an idea, the belief that Japan could win a modern industrial war through willpower alone. The green hell of Guadalcanal had taught a new truth. Modern war belongs not to the bravest, but to the best prepared. By January 1943, the struggle for Guadalcanal had reached its final act, and this time the outcome was never in doubt. The final offensive, imagine the scene. Humid dawn light filtering through shattered palms, the once terrifying jungle now eerily quiet. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, a powerful combination of Marine and Army divisions, was preparing to strike. Their mission was not uncertain, not desperate. It was methodical. The clean, relentless precision of a machine that now knew exactly how to win. American artillery thundered from concealed positions. Shells screamed through the canopy. Overhead, Henderson Field's aircraft circled like hawks, ready to dive on any target that moved. Offshore, naval gunfire pounded Japanese strongholds into silence. It was the full expression of American combined arms warfare. Air, land, and sea working in perfect rhythm. The Japanese, weakened by months of starvation, malaria, and dwindling ammunition, resisted with courage that bordered on the superhuman. But their efforts had become gestures of defiance, not of strategy. Each skirmish was a fight against inevitability. On February 9, 1943, American patrols pushing through the tangled jungle near Cape Esperance made a startling discovery. The enemy was gone. Under the cover of night, the Japanese had vanished, evacuated by their navy in one of the few operations that had gone according to plan. General Patch sent a short, triumphant message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. 6 months of unrelenting combat, of heat, disease, starvation, and heroism had culminated in the first major American ground victory against Japan. The lessons of defeat and victory. But Guadalcanal was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible, a place where both nations learned who they truly were. For Japan, the lessons were brutal. The myth of the invincible warrior, the faith in spirit over steel, had died among the palms. Individual courage, once believed to conquer any foe, had proven helpless against systematic disadvantage. The weapons of victory were not swords and bayonets, but logistics, coordination, and industrial might. Tactics that had brought glory in China, night assaults, close quarters charges, contempt for material weakness, had met their end against the Americans' patient. Fortified defenses. The jungle, once an ally to Japanese soldiers, had become a prison. A few officers grasped what this meant. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who had observed the campaign firsthand, wrote later that Japan must completely reassess its conception of war. He saw clearly what his superiors refused to admit, that America was fighting an industrial war, and that Japan, without comparable production, could never prevail. But institutions steeped in tradition changed slowly. Official reports after Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, unexpected enemy strength, and unfavorable circumstances. They did not blame flawed doctrine. They did not confess that a modern mechanized opponent had rendered the Japanese concept of war obsolete. Those who survived knew better. They had arrived on Guadalcanal as the proud vanguard of an empire. They left as skeletal survivors, haunted and hollow-eyed, carrying with them the understanding that Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies from veterans speak with quiet tragedy. "We learned that the Americans were not weak," one officer wrote. "They were strong, not only in weapons, but in organization, in leadership, in their ability to endure." It was a revelation bought with blood and hunger. The American awakening for the Americans, Guadalcanal taught a different set of truths. The campaign proved that U.S. troops could not only match the Japanese in courage and ferocity, they could defeat them. The illusion of Japanese invincibility was gone. Marine and Army units had shown that defensive discipline, combined arms coordination, and logistical superiority could destroy even the most determined enemy. Yet the Americans also gained something else: respect. They saw that their adversaries would fight to the death. That surrender was rare not out of arrogance, but of belief. Japanese soldiers endured the unimaginable: starvation, disease, hopelessness, and still advanced into machine gun fire. That unwavering devotion left an impression the Americans never forgot. Attempts to encourage surrender, leaflets, broadcasts, promises of food and care met with almost no success. Out of 36,000 Japanese soldiers who fought on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, most too sick or wounded to resist. The turning of the tide, strategically, the implications of Guadalcanal reached far beyond the island's swamps and ridges. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field proved that its outer defensive perimeter could be breached. For the Allies, this was the moment the war in the Pacific shifted from defensive to offensive. From that point on, the question was no longer whether Japan could be stopped. It was how fast it could be driven back. The United States, with its colossal industrial base, would now dictate the pace of war. Japan, bleeding men, ships, and aircraft it could never replace, began its long retreat. Guadalcanal had broken more than an army. It had broken an illusion, the belief that willpower alone could triumph over an industrial empire. Legacy of the island. The veterans who left Guadalcanal on both sides never forgot it. For the Japanese, it was the place where certainty died, where they saw, perhaps for the first time, the futility of courage without supply. For the Americans, it was where confidence was born, where they learned that discipline and unity could overcome terror, hunger, and exhaustion. When historians later searched for the moment the Pacific War truly turned, They returned again and again to this island, a strip of jungle and coral soaked with rain and blood, where two visions of warfare met, and only one survived. Guadalcanal was not just a victory, it was a revelation, the moment the modern world came crashing through the myths of empire. When the smoke cleared and the jungles of Guadalcanal fell silent, the survivors, those few who had endured 6 months of chaos, hunger, and exhaustion, emerged transformed. The legacy of the fighters for the American Marines and soldiers, the island became both a graveyard and a classroom. Those who survived carried home not only memories of horror, but lessons that would shape the rest of the Pacific campaign. They became the core of new divisions, teaching fresh recruits the hard truths of jungle warfare, how to fight in mud and darkness, how to dig in under shell fire, how to coordinate infantry, artillery, and air support into a single lethal rhythm. The 1st Marine Division, withdrawn from Guadalcanal in December 1942, was a shattered but seasoned force. Months of rest and recovery followed before it returned to battle, stronger, wiser, and tempered by the fire of experience. For the Japanese survivors, there was no such reprieve. The men rescued during Operation K were scattered across distant islands, sent to reinforce other doomed outposts of the crumbling empire. They carried with them not only the scars of starvation, but something deeper, the psychological weight of defeat. They had seen the enemy's true face, organized, tireless, and far more capable than Tokyo's propaganda had ever admitted. Many would not live to tell the tale again. The island itself, Guadalcanal, remained scarred for generations. Wrecked aircraft rusted in the humid air. Hulks of tanks and trucks lay half swallowed by the jungle. The beaches were littered with twisted metal, spent shells, and silent bombs that decades later would still claim lives. Yet, from this devastation, Henderson Field rose again, expanded, strengthened, and transformed into a major Allied base that would project power deep into the Solomons. The airstrip that once symbolized desperate defense now became the launch point for an advancing tide. The lessons of the campaign. For military historians, Guadalcanal was a revelation. It was the first real test of modern amphibious warfare, where the coordination of naval, air, and ground power decided victory. It proved that courage alone was not enough. Modern war, they realized, was an equation of logistics, technology, and endurance. Bravery mattered, yes, but bravery needed bullets, medicine, food, and communication. It needed systems that worked. The human cost was staggering. More than 7,000 Americans and Japanese died in the naval clashes surrounding the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000, killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses reached over 30,000, victims not only of battle, but of starvation and disease. Thousands more on both sides would bear tropical illnesses and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. And yet, from the cold perspective of strategy, the price had purpose. Guadalcanal was the turning point, the moment when the Allies shifted from defense to offense. It proved unmistakably that Japan could be beaten in ground combat. It revealed the patterns that would define the rest of the war: air and naval dominance, supporting relentless, systematic advance. Two visions of war collide at its core. Guadalcanal was not merely a military struggle. It was a philosophical collision between two worlds. On one side stood an army bound by the belief that spirit transcends matter, that courage and sacrifice could overcome any material disadvantage. On the other was a force that believed in the science of war, in logistics as the lifeblood of victory, in coordination and firepower as extensions of human will. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these opposing ideals met. And there, amid the rain and the blood, the verdict was rendered. The side that could sustain itself, supply itself, and coordinate its power won. The Japanese realization for the Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal was a revelation written in agony. They realized that their training had lied to them. Their tactics belonged to another era, one where courage could still decide battles. On Guadalcanal, courage starved. It bled, and it died beneath the relentless grind of a war machine that never ran out of shells or food. The soldiers who limped away understood a truth their leaders still denied. Japan had entered a war it could not win through valor alone. The American transformation. The Americans, too, were changed. They had proven to themselves and to the world that they could match and surpass the Japanese in courage and endurance. They had discovered the power of their own industry, the effectiveness of their doctrine, and the strength that came from unity of command. They learned how to fight in jungles, how to build supply lines across oceans, how to blend firepower and maneuver into something unstoppable. The myth of Japanese invincibility was gone, replaced by respect for a fierce opponent and confidence in their own ability to prevail. The terror of systems. The Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal did not fear the Americans as individual fighters. What terrified them was the system itself, the endless roar of artillery that never fell silent, the aircraft that always returned, the supplies that never ceased to arrive. They faced an enemy who seemed inexhaustible, whose weapons, medicine, and ammunition flowed as endlessly as the tide. How could one fight such an enemy? How could courage stand against a machine that never slept? This realization, that valor alone could not overcome modernity, marked the true end of Japanese offensive power in the Pacific. The shift that changed the war. From Guadalcanal onward, the pattern was set. Japan would fight on the defensive, retreating from island to island as American power surged forward. The lessons learned in that sweltering jungle became the blueprint for victory. Mastery of logistics, coordination between services, and overwhelming sustained firepower. Guadalcanal was where the modern age of warfare revealed itself in full, not as a contest of heroes, but as a contest of systems. And in that crucible of mud, steel, and human endurance, one truth emerged, terrible and clear. In the age of industrial war, spirit without supply was nothing but sacrifice.